I was just laughing when I was looking at Wimbledon results on ESPN.com to see what's going on over there since I don't have TV access. And they have those ads at the bottom of the page. And one of them says something like, Tiger Woods' ex-wife shows off her huge size in like whatever island country she's in. There's no picture. There's no further information. But a headline that had me reeling, I don't know, for the past 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. I've just been trying to spin that into some relevance here for our beautiful 4th of July week show. Something like maybe she's the perfect immigrant, or maybe something about being very much a symptom of American imperial decline, if you want to get negative with it. So now our immigrants are people who show up, they get wealthy through divorce after marrying a celebrity athlete, only to end up as fodder for a clickbait ad that provides no tangible economic value. And that also says she's a fat cow on vacation. This woman was a model from Sweden and ended up as the perfect modern American. Checks all the boxes. Shows off her huge size. I didn't click to see what they mean. Is she obese now? Do they mean she just has huge tits? Either way, it's another time of year to celebrate with parades and barbecues, our own huge size. Lots of great memories for me and moments from our major summer holiday, Independence Day. So if you're listening, make sure you go out, meet some of your neighbors. Even if it's raining. I know summertime we get a lot of storms just randomly pop up, but you can still show up in your neighbor's driveway. After your son shows his girlfriend, their daughter, your priceless Nazi plate, and you show up in that driveway and you kiss Kevin Spacey on the mouth. You let him know how much you love the United States of America. Of course, he's going to push you away, and so you go back home soaked from the rain. You look in the mirror, you see an American, but an American who's had better days. You see the years ticked one by one on your face. You always just keep waiting for the weekend to come, for some imaginary fame that never seems to produce, for a retirement that's probably not going to be that great. You don't have enough money, and cost of living's more, and you're broken down. You wait for all these things while nothing actually arrives. You're on this treadmill, the treadmill of meaninglessness, the treadmill of watching meaningless content, new outrage cycles, and streaming shows. It's July 4th. It's been raining all week, so you won't even get to see any fireworks this year. That makes you angry. And it dawns on you that your neighbor just rejected your homosexual advances. Great, now he's going to yap to everyone about it, and your deep, closeted secret is going to be a whisper campaign that follows you around town for the rest of your life. Well, fuck it. Nothing ever happens anyway. So you grab your pistol and you march back over there to give that neighborino the what for. All because your son wanted to date the fat-titted neighbor girl and violated the sanctity of your beautiful German-made plate. That's what set this all in motion. If it just didn't rain on the 4th of July. And that's what Independence Day is all about, folks. Declaring your independence from the right of your middle-aged neighbor to wave his sexy body around, working out in his garage, without being passionately kissed in the rain. But nothing ever happens. And I think it's great that we've gotten a settling down of nothing ever happening, especially in the realm of Middle East tensions. And now, hopefully, we have another week where things are just chill and we all get to enjoy some beautiful fireworks. Let's all shut up about whether or not the Iranian nuclear program was destroyed or even slightly inconvenienced. Go out and eat a hot dog, head to the pool, and show off your own huge size. But there was another example for a short 12-day period where the absurdity of the act of war was being played out on social media through memes once again. And this has been a common theme since the Ukraine videos of guys getting blown up or showing how grotesque it all is. And then you've got these clowns posting memes from government or other affiliated accounts for this Iranian-Israel conflict. And the footage that came out in this 12-day skirmish wasn't as bad in terms of, being as gruesome, the ones I saw anyway, as Ukraine or Gaza. So I didn't have to see anything like that on the timeline. The 12-day conflict was just a bunch of shit like, yeah, we blew up the nuclear facilities, and then Iran firing back that token response, and then them and the Israelis firing at each other until the very last minute before the ceasefire took hold. You did get the video of Caitlyn Jenner in a bunker, just to pile on what a joke everything is. But before all that, in this story, I thought maybe it had died out. Big story was about Elon and Trump, their beef, which has now been reignited because of the big, beautiful bill passing. And I don't know anything about that. Elon's probably correct that it sucks, and now he's going to support Thomas Massie and try to primary other people. And I can't imagine any giant bill which gets through Congress that's really any good. There might be some things that are beneficial, but maybe the Genius Act was good because that did something, stablecoins or crypto, it's supposed to make my bags go higher. I don't know. I don't remember which one that was. Again, I know nothing about legislation, but Papa's got some capital gains that need to be further pumped and then harvested. So whatever it takes to make that happen, I'm in favor of. That's what I was concerned about the first go round of their beef. Just saying to myself that I do hope this spurg, Elon Musk, shuts up because he's making the market tank. It's bad enough that crypto, goes down at the exact same time every day when the New York market's open now because of those fucking ETFs. I'm pretty sure that's the reason why. You look at the charts every day, crashes in the morning. But big development, maybe Elon gets denaturalized as a citizen and deported along with the communist mayor guy. That way, X/Twitter finally folds. Twitter and millions of people will have to find somewhere else to talk about the same exact things every week. They can't go on Blue Sky. They'll get banned from there. Because that's a stronghold of the Dems, the libs. And then the president deports those two, Elon and the mayor guy, but gives Tiger Woods' ex-wife the Presidential Medal of Freedom because Tiger is now dating Vanessa Trump, Donald Trump Jr.'s ex-wife. So that might be a little jab at her. And she gets presented as the model immigrant once again, this time for propaganda purposes. I am really glad that this story is looping back around because of the constant narrative churn and just straight up digital fatigue. I had mostly forgotten about their catfight. Out of sight, out of mind. In the sea of memes and missile attacks or about missile attacks and Peter Thiel memes. that one's still really making me laugh. The one just his insane facial expressions, his insane look, or whatever the fuck is wrong with him, or whatever stress he's under. Just like Peter's facial expression, I too often feel overwhelmed and unable to reflect or think about what has happened in the context of nothing ever happening. Memories just being frittered away by making hundreds of micro decisions each day, thanks to my use of technology. But this non-event, this unfortunate love affair souring, has gotten a second wind. And thanks to the way that memory works, especially mine, a second helping will embed in my brain that the president and a hair transplant success story had a very public beef in the year of our Lord 2025. But just thinking about the entire timeline so far, saying that you're the reason Trump won the election is pretty good strategy, right? He's certainly not the type to get bothered by someone trying to show him up publicly. Right, Elon? I know. Trump saying that he really helped Elon Musk is fucking hilarious. That Spurg really torched his own businesses to support DJT in a lot of ways. If he doesn't get the robo-taxis going en masse, Tesla is toast amongst half the population now that will not buy his cars. And even people overseas. Especially if there are tariffs and shit. Unless people don't need a car moving forward and the Teslas are just going to be advanced Waymos or somehow outcompete Waymo's. Dude just nuked his entire brand and reputation so that he could be the Doge guy for a couple months. The Doge plan that failed, because it was always going to fail. The swamp is undrainable. Honestly, what fight does Elon bust think he's going to win here? Like him or not, Trump has shown himself to be untouchable. The entire apparatus of the state and foreign governments couldn't topple him. Guy literally turned his head at the perfect moment. At what point of this unreal run that he's had going over the past decade do you just conclude that whether he means to or not, or whether he stumbles into victory or not, he will prevail if you test him? Now, I am someone who tends toward the mystical and unexplained answers for things. Well, because it's fun and makes life more interesting. But I don't see how you can look at Trump's entire existence and not be like, damn, there is some force, divine or otherwise, that won't let this dude lose until this storyline has fully played out. Trump is, and always has been, elite at beefing with people and institutions. He's an all-timer at this. Elon, that's not your forte. In comparison, it's not your forte. The president took on the entire apparatus of the state for the past 9 years and came back again and again. And he's president again. That's not your strength, especially when you're an autist who was in the middle of a meltdown level rage quit live on Twitter, live on X, sorry. Like, you're catching strays from some goofball you paid to have your child, and you think you're going to go against Trump. And then now he's been saying that, actually, we need a new party, a common sense political party that represents 80% of the people in the middle. That is something a high school AP government student would say. That's not how any of this works, motherfucker. You think people haven't thought of a third party? As if that's going to solve all the rotten decay and corruption and completely topple the nodes of power that have been built up over the last 100+ years, in particular in Washington, D.C. and New York and all across the country. Think that's how it works, Elon? Jesus. But I do wonder if those people I've seen for the past few months protesting in front of the Tesla dealership are ever going to start feeling like silly geese. I mean, it was pretty much all middle-aged to older white people. And one random person waving a Mexican flag for some reason at a protest about Tesla or Doge or whatever, which, that really whips me up into a nationalistic frenzy, especially this week. But I'm remembering it this week on 4th of July. Oof, fuck you, pal. Be honest, there was never going to be any serious budgetary cuts. That's an impossibility. And the currency will be debased, the dollar, until there's a complete final ending crisis, or shit just really sucks for 10 to 20 years until, it turns around. Unless you're someone who owns precious metals and Bitcoin. Not that I'm selling, or not that I'm sponsored, but I'm just passing that info along, as they're now going to try the economic growth and inflate away the currency playbook for fixing the unsustainable level of debt. How funny is this going to be if this is the thing, this beef between these two, that derails human spaceflight? Like, Elon gets deported, and the budget and contracts for SpaceX gets axed, and then the Chinese take over the moon. All because of this beef between these motherfuckers. Here's an idea I've been, tossing about. Maybe it's time we get back to some real American values. Stop letting this South African interloper get involved with everything. I want ExxonMobil back in charge, back to that old position. Just like that one book from over a decade ago, Private Empire, talks about. Bring them energy boys back into the fold. Give me the 7 sister oil majors back to having power and influence in our domestic and foreign policies. Enough with this Techsburg oligarchy with their shitty-looking poverty sci-fi aesthetic. Oh, you're a billionaire wearing a t-shirt everywhere? Cool. If I were that rich, I'd be dressed like a sultan. Some dude that walked out of an Orientalist painting or a Lord Byron poem. have an actual harem of women, not just giving turkey basters to randoms I paid on the internet to have different kids by a bajillion different kids. I guess that does somewhat transition into something I wanted to talk about this week. The audiobook portion of my reading lately has basically been nothing but books about the dollar or other structural networks that the U.S. government uses to exert power and influence over other countries and us. It's actually kind of funny since a lot of these books were released recently before the Tariff Day announcement that pushed a lot of foreigners and foreign governments even further away from us. Good idea, bad idea, who knows? But the effect, from their point of view, the foreigners, is to accelerate their alternatives to the dollar, try to diversify away, and the U.S. as a trusted source of stability to the extent that they can. Now, this process was already going to happen no matter what, and DJT just accelerated it. Obviously, you are still going to do some business with us and our giant consumer market, but maybe significantly cut back on holding stocks and treasuries and other investments. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, especially with stablecoins and how much that stems some of the losses. All of these books talk about how the U.S. built global power, not just through the dollar, but through the infrastructure around it. SWIFT, it's not owned by the U.S. government, but it's more like a consortium of banks that operate that, but they still have to play by the rules. And then you have dollar clearing systems that are in the U.S., our legal jurisdiction, our reach, and we also, in a lot of ways, are the backbone of the internet, and a lot of the tech companies that we have get used. And we also now have AI, and a lot of the switching and network of the internet is built here and still operates quite heavily. We still have a giant footprint there. So the one book is Underground Empire. It's about how the new phase of the empire is made of networks and choke points. It's more on the actual infrastructure and talks about the internet, while the other books, Choke Points and Treasuries War, are more about the sanctions that we put on other countries and how we started really getting into the economic warfare side of things. Stablecoins, at least from what I've been reading, may complicate that empire. That's why they were so adamant about passing that bill. So on the one hand, stablecoins extend dollar dominance in countries with very unstable currencies, like whether you're talking Argentina or Nigeria, Lebanon. People can use USDC and USDT to hold dollars without a U.S. bank account or even interacting with any other foreign banks or banks within their jurisdiction. So if they want to do a cross-border payment or a series of cross-border payments, they can settle and exchange dollar-backed stablecoins, which I suppose can be exchanged by the transactors for dollars in digital form at least, and have a safer pegged asset to exchange at some point in time for their local currency. Then maybe use Bitcoin as the neutral base layer asset for individuals, and gold will be for nation states, so that their purchasing power is increased over the longer term and not held in a debasing dollar. So they'll hold Bitcoin for longer term, and the shorter term transactions will be using stablecoins. The more that digital assets get used, the more stablecoins get used. The more that treasuries need to get purchased to peg the stablecoins to the dollar. And since Bitcoin isn't controlled by one country, it can be of service to attracting more people to the network and thus allowing the dollar to retain some of its international strength. That's dollarization without the same infrastructure setup, and it strengthens the dollar's reach far beyond the formal financial system. That's the idea. But at the same time, stablecoins are still, in a lot of ways, bypassing traditional choke points. They don't need SWIFT. They don't have to go through correspondent banks. And when they're offshore, decentralized, or privacy-focused, they create these blind spots, these zones where the U.S. can't visibly see them and influence or control them. However, I saw this long thread on X by someone named Isabella Kaminska, and her take on this was interesting to me. So The idea is that stablecoins, especially the dollar-pegged ones like USDC and Tether, are being quietly used as instruments to re-dollarize the world on American terms. And those other countries I was talking about, those poorer countries, or the ones where the local currencies are unstable and they don't have much access to the global dollar system, stable coins are moving in to fill that void. And then they get access to digital dollars. Instead of the straight up centralized central bank digital currency that we more conspiratorial minded people have been talking about, the US seems to be, at least, delegating some control or a lot of control to the market, letting multiple competing stablecoin issuers build the rails of the financial layer. A different type of control, but it's still a layer of control. So she gives the example of Tether, saying it's like offshore. Its redemption policy is selectively enforced at times and frankly kind of opaque. But it cooperates with law enforcement, and it happens to be based in El Salvador, where Bukele is in charge, in a country where the U.S. maintains a quiet influence there now, where there's a meeting of financial ambiguity and dollar loyalty. So if you're someone the U.S. considers a good actor, if we like you, you can move between onshore and offshore systems fine. You can redeem your coins and you can have access to dollar liquidity that you need to operate. But if you're not, if you're trying to launder money, sell drugs, evade sanctions, good luck taking Tether to court in El Salvador. So that's like the stick they're threatening you with. And she says the carrot is the dollar liquidity and low fees and a path to local economic stabilization without taking orders directly from the Federal Reserve. So you can participate in the U.S. system through the use of stablecoins without having to do dollar swap lines directly with the Fed. And you get more independence. In exchange, you just don't piss us off, I guess, which I guess is still plenty of influence. And then she's like, the EU is going the other route. They're going full centralization, designing a digital euro that's forcing stablecoin issuers under something called MiCA. I don't know what that is. I guess some law. They have to hold reserves inside the European banking system. And they are also tightening the Know Your Customer and AML regulations across the board. And they're building like a fortress, the Europeans. Now, that doesn't export very well. That creates friction, and there's not a lot of liquidity outside of that system. So the EU is trying to protect its monetary perimeter, and the US is exporting monetary utility. It's like quietly doing it. It's offering some flexibility, but it's also doing it selectively. So it's not just keeping the dollar alive. It's not just about that. It's also making it the default option for people who don't trust their governments or banks or currencies. And it's allowing it in like a hands-off sort of way, and that the market just takes care of. Her ideas about what's going on connect back to that Underground Empire book, where the authors describe how the U.S. just kind of stumbled and realized that they had this power to control these networks by holding the choke points of finance, surveillance, and information. Stablecoins in that framework might be the next generation of the model. They're not choke points at this point in time, but they're flows. They're, permission, ambiguity. You're allowed to flow money back and forth, but that sets up a system where there is potential choke points in the future, I guess. So the U.S. is exporting dollar-based stability without demanding rule-taking. And if they can do this threads the needle and retains the monetary empire that we've built since Bretton Woods. Underground Empire, the book, their central argument is pretty simple, that the U.S. has, often unintentionally, they've built a hidden empire of global control through, not through military force, but by exploiting the infrastructure of globalization itself. And so the book shows things like the global banking networks, data cables, internet traffic, semiconductors. All these things are actually highly centralized and a lot of key choke points. And much of that centralization actually runs through the U.S. In this book, like the choke points and Treasury's War books as well. They talk about how after 9/11, the U.S. really discovered that it could use this control in very unprecedented ways. Much like the Patriot Act ushered in new uses of power beyond the scope of the initial bill, what started as an effort to cut off financing to terrorist cells and stuff like that, that turned it into a broader playbook of economic coercion. So we use sanctions, export controls, limit data access, and legal reach to enforce our strategic objectives worldwide, or at least the objectives of the U.S. government. This wasn't centrally planned by the government. The banks and other public companies built out all these networks as a way to expand their businesses and actually get around government centralization. But because those businesses wanted to control those networks themselves, they ended up creating all these choke points that they had control of. But the U.S. government got the ability to really access all these separate entities after 9/11. Plus, the so-called Eurodollar market got unleashed to satisfy the demand for dollars internationally and the settlement of transaction in dollars. So every Eurodollar has to be backed by a real dollar by law. The result was that there's more dollars outside the U.S. than inside, and it creates this insatiable demand for our currency that the Treasury and central bank doesn't control, but they control the supply as an influence tool or flat out weapon, and they can control who gets the swap line for dollars that they need in order to do business. And the dollars that people use also have to be cleared through U.S. banking institutions, so we can hold you up that way as well. And then the other area of choke point, it's the internet. The internet developed all these choke points because even though it is a decentralized network, a lot of the main infrastructure, the nodes of the infrastructure were built on existing stuff in a small number of places. This is why Northern Virginia is such a choke point for things like Amazon Web Services, which a lot of people host, have their cloud hosting on there, as there were already earlier parts of the network that were concentrated in Northern Virginia in the 90s. And then, of course, it was a Defense Department project before that. So it was all just built on top of each other. So even though it's a decentralized network, a lot of the flows still move through these choke points, and the government has access to information and the ability to shut things down, or at least trip people up. And the authors of this book, they're describing all this as an accidental empire built by officials responding to the crisis of 9/11 and then another crisis. And they're just stacking tools on top of tools until one day they realize that they've really constructed a global machine of different tools they can use. And when used in concert or separately, they can exert enormous influence on their adversaries, or even more recently, and it's been happening more and more recently, are allies. Banks, tech platforms, cloud infrastructure, all of these became tools for surveillance and leverage and pressure, and the world has started to notice. Now we're getting pushback growing against this system. China has been building, and they've already built their own networks, whether it's financial or technological, legal, to escape U.S. control, but most of that is really confined to their country and doesn't hold as much influence outside of the country. And the European Union is rethinking its whole strategy. They're trying to shift from the usual rules-based globalization that's been going on for decades now to one that can survive in a more coercive world when people are using economic warfare. Meanwhile, the USG keeps on expanding its toolkit of economic coercion. They'll blacklist companies, they weaponize export controls, cut off access to semiconductors and AI chips. Then again, the tariff threats and the Russian sanctions, especially when they seized the Russian bank reserves, which they've never done to previous enemies. They didn't do that to the Japanese or even the Nazis. That was the first time they ever did that. Those two things have really accelerated other countries to try to set up alternatives to the dollar and technological system that's in place, to have alternatives, at least somewhat, to the United States. And the authors in this book are warning that we've entered a phase where every new tactic becomes normalized. And once these measures that once were like extraordinary uses of power, they just become routine. And these tools are supposed to be more selective, but they come with real risks, even though they are powerful. It does erode your credibility and your power base when you've abused these tools, which we have. So when you treat these economic systems like battlefields, the global economy becomes unstable and vulnerable to not just the market forces, but geopolitical escalation. And again, it's kind of funny because they brought out this book before the latest phase of all this. And they're not talking about dismantling the system, but they're urging officials, U.S. officials, to use it responsibly. They argue for like creating new institutions focused on economic security, not just traditional military security. They want us to use restraint to know the difference between actual threats and just like legitimate global competition, and avoid trying to turn every transaction into a tool that we can use to coerce or control somebody. So power isn't just about military, or even necessarily mainly about military projection of force, but it's something that's wired into the systems that we use every day. The dollar, the cloud, the microchip, the server. That's where real power is living now. And if we don't understand it, we risk being ruled by it, or watching it get abused to the point that it just collapses because nobody fucking wants to be a part of it anymore. And thus brings us down. Or maybe we, just re-up through stablecoins or whatever.
We'll be right back.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of stuff lately. I checked out the new Adam Curtis documentary series called Shifty. And this is another one of these where he uses old news footage and interviews and loosely interweaves them into a coherent story. No voiceover, like in something like hypernormalization. Just the text captions at the bottom of the screen, like he did in that Trauma Zone series about the collapse of the Soviet Union. To me, this is like an extension or even remix of the Mayfair State and maybe one other documentary that he's done. Obviously, the same sort of themes that are found in basically everything else that he's come out with is found here. This one is specifically about living in Britain in the late 20th century, basically the Thatcher rise to power in 1979 to the end of the century. That's the time period that we're covering. So the IMDb description says, quote, "When power begins to shift in society, everything becomes unstable, exciting, and frightening." It's hard to even explain what it's about at times, even though that sentence sums it up basically. Because like a lot of Adam Curtis's stuff, it's not really a straight story. It's more like he's grabbing hundreds of different threads from different decades and weaving them into this narrative that's like moody. And this one is a haunting mood, a feeling that something fundamental has changed, but nobody in the country can name it. So one of the massive changes in society that he explores is monetarism. That theory and its implementation by Thatcher. So they're using money as the rational basis for the system to run on. And how this was the catalyst for really unleashing the power of finance and gradually stripping the power away from politicians and the government as a whole to enact or even enforce whatever policies or laws that they would have in the past to counteract these market forces that are taking over. So they implement these policies and almost immediately interest rates go up, factories close down around the country, and unemployment shoots up too. But Thatcher's determined. She sticks with the plan, despite the fact that nothing seems to be working in the way they thought it would. So power in this series is big, and the individual has no power. And even government advisors in their role don't have any real weight behind them in the face of that new power. So in this documentary, power is shifting from politicians and the centralized power of the state through money, which then liberates itself. But people as individuals who are like having to deal with all this, their sense of themselves is also shifting. So democracy gets eroded and you can't really stand up against power on your own. So as a result, you become atomized, you turn inward. And I think it's the second episode where he starts with this idea of distrusting. Suspicion is everywhere. Governments, people, even your own memory, or anything like we called a collective memory or narrative, national narrative. And he even brings in the rise of remix culture in music. So sampling and re-editing the past. And even that, on that level, how that subtly messes with our sense of what's real. Like if you can cut and paste anything, what is then authentic after that? What is your history? And what's just a stylized, reworked echo of the past? And throughout this episode, paranoia is bleeding into everything. So this is where he's showing the rise of surveillance and data collection and people being tracked or categorized or stored in a database somewhere. But it's not just like government's doing it anymore. This is how he shows how it becomes later on, after this time period and our own time period, it becomes getting tracked through apps and companies and tech giants and their algorithms, and how we start to internalize all that. We become our own observers. We post, we try to get likes and watch ourselves being watched. And this feedback loop that just changes how you exist, how you relate with the world. Adam Curtis is exploring all this, how this started last century. For example, he shows this one news report where people in the 1980s are being shown information about themselves that exist on a computer network. So credit reports and some personal information, and they can't believe that this exists. That's shocking to them. So we get to episode 3, and there's a further deregulation of financial markets. And this one shows how they introduce privatized mortgages, more privatized mortgages, which helps to spur a real estate boom, even as the older industrialized economy is dying. It's being hollowed out. So you have entire swaths of the population that are being left behind. Meanwhile, GDP number go up. And some people within the system are becoming very wealthy, and they start turning old abandoned factories into luxury apartments to help spur the real estate boom. Then he shows that the intellectuals and members of the upper crust aren't really liking Thatcher and really don't like that the people she represents have turned their backs on the liberal elite, so to speak. So the lower middle class, and there's this divide between them and the upper crust, the liberal class. And those people are turning away from politics and moving their attention towards culture and art. And these elites, intellectual and otherwise, have a growing contempt for the working class and just go further into their own niche interests. And that's just a further aspect of the theme of losing control and people turning inward, as the outside world seems like it's just doing whatever, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no recourse against it. And there's this growth of individualism and the focus on your individual body and your individual feelings. That's a common theme in history, at least according to some people's theories. For instance, the philosophy of Stoicism took root during that period of Rome because it's an attempt to control yourself in a world that's degrading. The empire is becoming harder to manage. The republic is dead, and you can't seem to get back on track with how things used to be or how you perceive things used to be. And other people in society are partaking in a self-absorbed gluttony. So you are pulling it back into an interior calm and control. And I guess we can extend that to today with this Stoic revival and use of meditation apps and the like as a way to turn away from our own insane society and culture. But getting back to the narrative of Shifty, Thatcher's advisors fear that she's unleashed finance as an abstract, and the collapse of British industry was in the interest of this new financial system. So that takes out the working class people, the middle class. But the rights and privileges of the aristocracy at the same time, they weren't privatized. So they're exempt from this, and they can still make money off their privileges of the past. And then we get to the late 1980s. We have the 1987 Black Monday stock crash. We have, in 1992, we have Soros breaking the Bank of England, the pound collapse. And Britain has lost control of its economy to international finance. And then we have another thread where there's Stephen Hawking and his theories about the universe being less stable or coherent, or there's being time outside of the human perception of time, where there's no beginning or end to anything. And even his own wife in here is saying that his hyper-rationalist worldview was dangerous and was leading people into a limited view of the world, a very strange, different outlook for life. And from here, Curtis shifts into a whole section about the 80s and 90s in Britain. So we have Thatcher, further deregulation, privatizing previously owned public companies like water, and then the mortgage privatization in housing. The dream of owning a home becomes this symbol of success, safety, a way to have identity. But then even that collapses and people fall into debt and they have negative equity. And what used to be a path to feeling like you belong turns into a trap. But again, the aristocracy, the elites don't have to play that game. Their land, their privilege, their overall power is totally untouched. The rules change for everybody else but them. So everything that was once collective or more collective, like jobs, housing, even water, becomes atomized, becomes privatized. And at the same time, people start pulling away from politics. The intellectuals and the left-leaning types don't trust Thatcher. And they don't organize. It turns to culture. So art, theory, aesthetics, and they're just retreating into style while everything outside keeps hollowing out. I listened to Adam Curtis in an interview on this, where he basically says that everything we're seeing now is theater. Like, no one knows really what's going on, but we act like we do. Politics, social media, the cycle of outrage, it's all pantomime. It's noise. And when reality feels that unstable, people are looking for other ways to feel grounded. He talks about this Ozzy Osbourne clip or quote where people are having to get fucked up and what that says about society. To me, I was like, what? Like, addiction to getting fucked up or just to cope with life is a problem, sure. But most people who have used alcohol or drugs don't have an addiction whatsoever. They might have addictions to other things, or at least bad habits. And most of what else they get into, like junk food, porn, or whatever, they're bad habits that have just become so entrenched in their lives. They're not necessarily addictions for all those people. They're not great, but on the drugs and alcohol front, ancients, tribes around the world have been getting fucked up in their religious ceremonies forever. It's something we like doing as humans. We like edge running our consciousness and expanding or contracting our perceptions. It's actually fun sometimes, enlightening to your life in some way. The Eleusinian mysteries were probably pretty dope. The ancient Egyptians used alcohol. Others used ecstatic dancing, chanting, and whatever else to shift their reality. That is some real shifty shit. The difference now is we do it alone, privately, with no ritual, no framing, no deeper context, and it's more prevalent. I mean, you don't think a person 3,000 years ago, if they had unlimited access to alcohol and drugs like we do, they wouldn't go for the same thing. It wouldn't have anything to do with feeling like everything's unstable or everything's chaotic. People were doing drugs in the 19th century. It was a lot more slow and stable back then. Now, you could argue the reason why, but a lot of the times it's just people like getting fucked up. But he also posits that in this interview that maybe mass democracy was a temporary phenomena spurred on by mass industrialization and that it's ultimately run its course. And we're now hyper individuals who are connected, but we still feel alone and powerless, which kind of sums up the whole vibe of the series. The frames that once bound us have fallen away. We used to get meaning from myth, shared symbols, ritual. Now it comes from whatever's trending, I guess. whatever you see on your phone, or nowhere at all. There is no meaning. But there's also the bigger thing that's going on that Adam Curtis is pointing to, how money became this runaway force. At some point, politicians were no longer willing or able to steer the ship. That power migrated into finance, into code, into global money flows. And we're just kind of floating in the sea, pretending we have control while watching the old structures that seem to make sense to us collapse around us. So in response to that, what do? We focus on ourselves. We do things like track our sleep. We log our feelings. We go to therapy. We read self-help books, trying to heal your fucking inner child. And sure, I guess some of that's good, maybe. But it's also lonely and not satisfying. Like, we're all trying to do maintenance on our own little islands while everything's sinking. Or at least that's what I think he's getting at here. And by the end of the series, what's really sticking with me isn't one factor, policy. It's his moody atmosphere, the sense that we're living in a world where everything used to seem to have meaning. Our work, our home life, identity, our family. But that's all been rebranded and sold back to us. And all those things have been hollowed out, emptied out. They're still there, but they're just empty. They have no real core or meaning in the same way. But for me, under all that, under the confusion and the simulation and coping that people are doing, I think there's something sacred trying to break through. And that's what I've been coming back to this entire podcast series, in between the dick jokes and everything. Like, Curtis isn't in this documentary offering a real hope. It's trying to name it, trying to offer this space of clarity, seeing what's going on behind the spectacle, all the narrative and everything like that, and how it took form. So maybe that's a starting point for what he's trying to accomplish, not fixing everything overnight, but seeing clearly, naming the illusions, and slowly remembering how everything's supposed to work, how to have something real, tell real stories, so that narratives don't just collapse under their own weight, that there's actually something to move us forward. If you buy his entire narrative, which I don't know that I necessarily do, all of it. But that's where I was at with Shifty, what I was thinking about. It's not really, I don't know, it's something, just kind of sit back, watch, absorb. But he is bringing up all these themes which is good that he is. And once you see them, it's hard to unsee them. And you can try to incorporate that into your own life.